Ethan looked at his world contained within the window and saw only someone else's perfect life. The New York sun, where he had lived for almost 30 years, was now just a memory, replaced by Denver's soft, gray sky. His new apartment, full of unpacked boxes, felt like an empty cave, only amplifying the feeling of loneliness that had followed him since his divorce. He had moved here to start with a clean slate, but the slate remained blank, and his pen was in another box he couldn't find. Instead, he found solace in someone else's life. From his window, located directly across the street, he watched a couple who lived in the house with the bright blue door, David and Emily Carter. He knew their names, knew they had just returned from Cappadocia, and before that they had been to Iceland and even earlier Japan. He knew they loved their camper van, that they drank coffee on the porch every morning, and even what kind of dog they had, a golden retriever named Luna. All of this information wasn't a secret. It was on public display in their Carter Adventures blog. Each day, their lives looked like a perfectly edited, warm movie shot on a professional camera. Not a phone. Their smiles were so genuine, their conversations so effortless that Ethan felt like he was watching aliens from another planet. A place where divorces, unpaid debts, or the emptiness in one's chest never existed. Ethan took a sip of his instant coffee, which tasted like stale water, and scrolled through their blog feed. In the latest video, they were holding hands, standing against a backdrop of mountain peaks, and Emily was talking about finding true meaning and harmony. It was another public moment, so perfect that it brought nothing but a feeling of profound weariness to Ethan. Meanwhile, on the other end of the block, Mia stood in the middle of her empty flower shop. It didn't have a sign yet, but she had already named it Flowers for Small Moments. It was her creed, her way of coping with the fact that her dream of a corporate career had crumbled when she was laid off. She believed that happiness lay not in big, glamorous events, but in quiet, small moments, like a flower given for no reason. But that belief didn't help when the bank sent a letter and the landlord called for the 6th time. Today she was trying to assemble a shelf for pots, but the instructions were in Chinese and one of the bolts was clearly missing. She was desperately trying not to cry. Her life was also in boxes, but they didn't contain the past. They contained an unfulfilled future. That evening, Ethan went for a walk, feeling stifled by his own inertia. He passed the Carter's house. An empty cup sat on the porch, and the door was closed. No sign of their recent weekend excursion. He walked around the other side of the house to cut through to the park and heard sounds that sharply contrasted with their online image. The voices were tense, the words jagged like broken glass. "Do you think this is fun, Emily? Do you think I want to smile for a camera all the time?" David's voice rang out full of anger. "This is our job, David. People expect this," Emily replied, her voice on the verge of hysteria. "Without this, we'll have nothing." Ethan's heart sank. He moved into the shadow of the trees so they wouldn't see him, and suddenly, everything fell into place. Everything he had seen was just an illusion, not reality. The sounds of the argument died down as suddenly as they had started, leaving Ethan standing in a silence that was more deafening than any scream. The illusion crumbled like a house of cards, and in place of the empty sadness he had felt before, a feeling of strange relief came over him. He wasn't alone in his imperfect world. No one was perfect, not even David and Emily Carter. They too were trying just like him to create something that looked like a perfect picture, but their lives, like his own, were full of cracks. He walked back to the main street, passing a row of old but neat houses, and then he saw her. Mia was standing in the doorway of a tiny shop, leaning against the frame. Her face was wet with tears, and in her hand she clutched a sheet of paper that looked like instructions. On the sidewalk beside her were scattered parts that were once furniture and a strange hexagonal wrench that clearly didn't fit any of the holes. Ethan stopped. He walked closer cautiously as if approaching a wild animal. "Do you need any help?" he asked. His voice was quiet and hesitant. Mia flinched and quickly wiped away her tears. She looked up at him with her large, slightly red eyes. "I'm okay. It's just this shelf. The instructions are in a language I don't understand, and a crucial bolt seems to be missing." Ethan smiled. A missing bolt is a classic. Maybe I can help. I'm good at reading instructions even if they're in Chinese. She let him in, and he found himself in an empty space, infused with the smell of fresh lumber and the faint scent of flowers that were not yet there. The air was tense, laced with her fear and hope. They worked together in silence, sorting through the parts. Ethan discovered that the missing bolt wasn't a problem if they replaced it with another. Mia told him about her vision for the shop, how she dreamed of selling not just bouquets, but floral arrangements that told stories. She wanted people to buy flowers not for big events, but for small moments to bring home the scent of spring, to give a smile to a neighbor, to simply brighten their day. "It was my dream," she said, her voice softening as she spoke about it. "After I got laid off, I realized I didn't want to be part of something big and soulless. I want to create something small but real, something that makes people a little happier." Ethan listened to her and something shifted in his eyes. He saw her determination, her passion, and it was so alive and genuine. It wasn't the perfect life he had watched on the blog. It was real life with tears, failures, and bolts scattered on the floor. And there was something so much more appealing in that. He was helping her, but in reality, she was helping him, filling his empty world. When the shelf was finally assembled, they looked at it like a work of art. It stood straight, sturdy, and looked much better than the drawing. Mia took 2 paper cups from a box, made coffee on a small hot plate, and handed one to Ethan. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know how I would have managed without you." They drank their coffee in silence, looking at the shelf that symbolized their shared, albeit temporary, victory. It was their first small moment together, and it was much better than any picture on the internet. Ethan found himself back at Mia's flower shop the next day, though he hadn't planned to. He came under the pretense that he had forgotten his hexagonal wrench, though he knew perfectly well it was in his pocket. In reality, his feet had brought him here on their own, as if seeking a saving island in the sea of his loneliness. This time they weren't assembling furniture, but were sitting on the floor looking at paint samples. Mia wanted to paint one wall a deep, rich green. She said, "It's the color of life, isn't it? I want this shop to be a place where people feel life, even if it's a little tattered." Her words resonated with him with surprising accuracy. Their collaboration became a quiet ritual. They worked together on the sign, carving the letters from wood. The smell of fresh paint and wood shavings replaced the emptiness that had settled in his apartment. They exchanged short but meaningful stories. He told her about his job as an architect, which he had left because he was designing buildings but had no life of his own. She talked about the pressure and burnout in the corporate world that made her flee. They spoke of the past, but without bitterness, simply as facts that had brought them to this moment. One evening, as they were drinking coffee in the shop, Ethan saw a familiar silhouette through the window. David and Emily Carter were returning home. They weren't smiling. David walked a little ahead, his shoulders tense, and Emily followed him in silence. Instead of the usual camera lens that always turned their movements into a graceful ballet, their bodies were listless and tired. Ethan involuntarily froze watching them. "What's up?" Mia asked, noticing his gaze. Ethan gestured toward the couple. "Neighbors, bloggers. They seem to have the perfect life." Mia looked where he was pointing and laughed softly. "The perfect life. You never know what's hidden behind the camera. Do you? I once saw them at the local market. She was holding a bouquet and he was yelling at her for spending too much money." The words were simple, but they were a confirmation for Ethan. He realized that his sadness was caused not so much by his own divorce, but by the feeling that he had lost this invisible race for happiness in which others seemed to be winners. Now he saw that it was a race he never wanted to win. His happiness wasn't in pictures, but in this small, struggling but genuine shop, and in Mia's eyes. They continued to work, and with each passing day, the shop filled with life, and along with it, their own worlds. Mia taught him to distinguish between different types of flowers and explained how each one had its own story. He in turn showed her how to properly secure a shelf so it wouldn't wobble and how to fix a broken lock. They didn't talk directly about their feelings. Instead, their conversations were filled with details about their small shared victories, choosing the right shade of paint, the perfectly assembled shelf, and a silent understanding that their problems hadn't disappeared, but now they were facing them together. One evening, when they had finished painting the last wall, Mia took 2 chilled drinks from the refrigerator and handed one to Ethan. "To a new beginning?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with hope. Ethan raised his drink to a real life. They clinked glasses, and that small gesture meant more to them than any trip, any blog, or any perfect picture. Ethan and Mia weren't just building a shop. They were building their own small, separate world. Ethan, who had spent his life designing shiny, cold skyscrapers, now found with surprise that he much preferred working with wood, paint, and most importantly, with Mia's ideas. Together they assembled shelves, welded the sign, and one time they even spent a whole evening trying to install an old cash register that Mia had found on an online auction. It was far more complex than any modern computer. But when it finally worked, their shared triumph was loud and genuine, as if they had won $1 million. Their conversations grew deeper. They stopped talking only about the past and began discussing the future. Mia dreamed of organizing floristry workshops for children, of her shop becoming a hub for the neighborhood. Ethan, who had no specific plans for the future, found that he was more interested in Mia's plans than his own. He started suggesting ideas for the window display, the lighting, even the logo. He was an architect who had finally found a project that had a soul. One day, as they were having lunch at a small table surrounded by garlands of dried flowers, Mia's phone rang. She looked at the screen and her face immediately tensed. She went into the other room and her voice became quiet, but Ethan could still hear snippets of phrases. "I'm sorry. I don't know what happened with the transfer. I'm trying." When she returned, her eyes were glassy. "The bank?" she said, trying to smile, but her lips trembled. "The rent payment was delayed, and they can't wait any longer. They said if I don't pay by the end of the week, they'll terminate the lease." The whole shop, filled with the scent of roses and jasmine, suddenly felt suffocating. Ethan saw how her dream, which was so close to reality, could crumble in an instant. His first thought was, "I can help her. I can lend her money." But he remembered that his own divorce had been tied to financial difficulties. He didn't want to be her savior. He didn't want their relationship to start with debt. Instead, he just silently took her hand. It was cold, but when he held it, it seemed to warm up. "Mia," he said, looking her directly in the eyes, "no matter what happens, you're not alone." These simple words of support were soul-warming. She didn't cry, but her shoulders relaxed. They sat like that for a while, holding hands, and the silence was filled with understanding and compassion. That evening, walking home, Ethan passed the Carter's house. The windows were brightly lit, and he saw Emily laughing into a camera as David placed a huge bouquet on the table for her. Their faces were happy, their movements perfect. But now, when Ethan looked at them, he saw not happiness, but a staged performance. Meanwhile, Mia was sitting at the table, her hands resting on the empty cash register, as if trying to pull some money out of it with the power of thought. The news from the bank had hit her like a heavy stone, crushing the fragile hope she had so carefully built. She looked at the floral arrangements that were already made, and imagined how they might wilt without ever seeing a customer. "We'll figure something out," Ethan said, but his voice didn't sound convincing. He was discouraged, too. Their shared work on the shop had been therapy for both of them, helping them get through the past. And now that therapy was in jeopardy. Mia suddenly lifted her head and a spark ignited in her eyes that surprised Ethan. "Pop-up. We'll set up a pop-up sale. We'll sell flowers on the street. This shop isn't ready for a grand opening yet, but we can start small. We can do this." Her voice sounded like she was trying to convince herself. The idea was crazy, but it was the only one. They began to prepare. The rest of the week turned into a mad race. They worked late into the night packing bouquets, hanging posters, and assembling a small stand that Ethan had built from leftover wooden boards. Even the Carters, when they passed by, gave them astonished looks as if they were two lunatics. "We need a helper," Mia said once. Ethan smiled. "You have me." He helped her not only physically but also morally. He told funny stories when she felt down and supported her when she thought nothing would work out. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running from a problem, but fighting. And the fight wasn't for something big and abstract, but for her dream, which had become a part of his own. In the morning, when they set up their stand, it began to rain. Felt like a mockery. Big drops drummed on the canopy, threatening to wash away all their enthusiasm. People passing by ran into the nearest cafes, and the street instantly emptied. Mia looked at Ethan, her face a picture of complete despair. "Our luck is terrible," she said quietly. "I knew it. This was a bad idea." Ethan silently took the umbrella they had bought just in case and walked a few steps away from the stand. He held it high above his head and began to wave it like a lighthouse, as if showing people that there was something waiting for them here, even in the downpour. He just stood there soaked and foolish, and his smile was the most genuine of all. A few minutes later, a man approached them. He was soaked to the bone, but his eyes shone with curiosity. "Are you selling flowers in the rain?" he asked. Mia nodded. "We're selling happiness, and it doesn't need the sun." The man smiled. He bought a small bouquet of yellow tulips. It was their first customer. By the end of the day, they had sold only a few bouquets. It was far from what they needed to pay the bills. "In 3 days, I could lose everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You won't lose anything. There's still time," Ethan said, holding her hand tightly. "We'll keep fighting." Suddenly, there was a knock on the window. It was David and Emily Carter. They stood there looking bewildered, holding a camera. "Do you mind if we film?" Emily whispered. "We saw what you were doing on the street, and it was so genuine. We want to share it. Maybe some of our followers will want to help." Ethan and Mia, though surprised, agreed. They stood in front of the camera as David and Emily told the story of the small shop fighting for its existence. They spoke about real feelings, not a perfect facade, and therein lay their power. When the Carters published the video, it quickly gained millions of views. That night, David and Emily lay in bed. They weren't fighting. They were just staring at the ceiling. "You know," David said quietly, "we were playing at happiness for millions, but today we saw what it really looks like. They were imperfect, but so genuine." Emily turned to him. "Yes. And I realized that we got so caught up in creating a picture that we forgot about what's really important to us. Maybe we should film a little less and just be a little more." Their conversation continued until morning, and for the first time in a long time, they felt not irritation, but true closeness. The next morning, Ethan and Mia hadn't even had time to hang the sign when a line had already formed on the street. People, moved by their story, had come from all over the city to buy bouquets. They bought everything they saw: roses, tulips, lilies, even just sprigs of greenery. They weren't looking for perfection. They wanted to support something real. Ethan and Mia worked without stopping, but their fatigue was sweet. At the end of the day, when the last customer left, they stood amidst empty shelves strewn with petals and counted the money. It was more than enough to pay the rent and have a reserve for a few months ahead. They had saved their shop, but something far more important. They had saved themselves. "To a new beginning," Mia said, looking at Ethan, her eyes shining. "To a real life," he replied. And together they turned a new page in their lives, understanding that true happiness lies in reality, not in ideals.